Hello everyone, I hope you can hear me well. My name is Agnieszka Drożdżel and I'm a learning and development consultant here at Vlerick Business School. And I would like to welcome you to another webinar organized together with AIJA, the International Association of Young Lawyers, in cooperation with us. AIJA is the only global association devoted to lawyers and in-house counsel for 45 and under. With over 4,000 members all around the globe, AIJA provides international opportunities for young lawyers to network, learn and develop through different activities. I'm very happy to say that it's already a fifth webinar that we organize in this partnership. Today, I have a pleasure to introduce to you my colleague who will appear on your screen very shortly, Veroniek Collewaert, professor and partner at Vlerick Business School, and our own expert in entrepreneurship. She will make sure to let you know how to nail your elevator pitch. Veroniek, I give the floor to you.
Thank you very much. I hope that you guys can see our screen. So hello everyone, welcome also from my side. So today what I'm going to do in this next hour is try and give you the key tips and tricks, if you will, on how to nail your elevator pitch. Now, for those of you who don't really know what a pitch is all about, it's really kind of the shortest version that you can possibly think of, and that means 2 minutes max, to convince an audience, right? If you'd have a little bit more time, think 15 minutes, you might be able to do some sort of presentation, and if you'd have even more time, you can actually develop a full-fledged business case. Now, I can already imagine that some of you are probably wondering, so why pitching, right? Why is this relevant for us? And that's a very valid question, because indeed pitching is something that we tend to associate with entrepreneurs, right? Which is why I'm here. It's what they do or have to do whenever they need to go out and convince investors and ask for money. But actually, there's something interesting that every single one of you shares with an entrepreneur whenever you're trying to convince someone, right? So whenever you're trying to get to some sort of an agreement, whether it's with a potential customer, trying to convince them why they should join you or your law firm versus another one, or whether it's, for instance, with a potential employee, convincing them why they should join your firm rather than someone else's. And that's in every single one of those instances. There's something that you know that the outside audience does not know, or at least does not know as well, right? There's a difference in information. Because you guys, everybody's going to say, we're the best law firm that's out there, right? That's what everybody says. So, but you know whether or to what extent that statement is actually true. For an outsider, that's harder to assess. And in order to convince that outsider, you need to have some sort of an effective pitch in place. And that requires a bit of preparation. So that's why we're here today, to make sure that you can convince every single person that you meet, whether it's an employee, potential customer, that you guys are the best ones. Remember, before I kind of go into what a pitch is and how you deliver a pitch, which is basically kind of the two key things we'll be focusing on, that whenever you are doing a pitch, really what you're trying to do is you're trying to get to the next step. I basically call this your Match.com moment, which I assume everyone in this international audience knows, and kind of think of it as a dating aspect. You're not asking, it's not a marriage proposal, right? What you're trying to do with a pitch is you're trying to get your hands on your first date. That's the goal. Foot in the door. Once you've secured that, you can try and kind of make your way through it to get to the actual deal, getting people to sign the contract, if you will. That's not going to happen immediately. And that's okay, right? So, but you're trying to get people enthused, trying to get them to consider your case, your firm, your individual proposition a little bit more closely, that they'll examine it in a little bit more detail than what they otherwise would have done. Now, we don't have a lot of time to go into this last aspect today, but something that I definitely want to mention before I dive into the pitch is most of what I'll focus on is what you guys can do yourselves, right? So your communication towards that outside audience. Now, of course, it's really important to remember is that communication works both ways. So it's really important to listen to how people react when you're first delivering that pitch. And that means both actively listening to what they're actually saying, as well as just watching people's body language, right? Do you see people kind of staring at you with a weird face? That might indicate they might not entirely get what you're saying. At the very least, whether or not you agree with that feedback, it probably indicates that there's something that you can tweak in your pitch to make it a little bit clearer. So that's just something I want to make sure that we kind of clarify up front, that even though most of what I'll be talking about is what you can do in terms of talking, don't forget to listen as well, right? So if you think about a pitch, what do you think are kind of the key essential parts that need to be in there? Any thoughts? And I'll be checking the chat window where I've seen plenty of international hellos to see who might have some ideas on what you think would go into a pitch. I see plenty of people typing. Great. Ciao. Okay. Saying hi could be a good idea to include a pitch. The who and do what. Exactly. The who actually method, that's a very interesting one. Because in my experience, because we consider that kind of so obvious ourselves, it's one of the things that most people tend to forget to do. And that's introducing who you are, right? Because not everybody will know who you are. And more importantly, why you're the best person for the job. So make sure that that's absolutely included in your pitches. The do what, I indeed think that kind of corresponds with sorry, what Floor is writing, the offer. In very fancy business terms, and that's what we call your value proposition, right? So what is it that you're bringing to the table? And obviously, that's the most important part of any pitch. If you only have 20 seconds, that's what needs to be in there, because that's how customers will decide on whether they will go with you or your competitor, right? And so basically what a value proposition reflects is more or less kind of what's the problem that you're focusing on, or the need, depending. So think of maybe a specific kind of area in law that you're focusing on. And then how are you doing that, right? What's your specific solution? Is there anything that makes you guys unique? And then obviously, depending on who you're pitching this to, who's the customer, right? Is your case, and I'll come back to this later on, is it a quality argument? Is that what you're trying to say? Is it more about costs? You're just cheaper than everybody else? All of that might be relevant things to include depending on who you're pitching to, right? If it's a CFO or a CEO. So remember who your customer is. What you also see in there next to people is the second point, is the numbers aspect. Basically, what you should try and do is include as many numbers as you possibly can to make sure that you convince outsiders that this is an interesting opportunity. Obviously, this will be slightly more important whenever your pitch is about either pitching really literally a new idea or when it's about saving costs, right? But numbers help to kind of justify the objective case. And then last but not least, also make sure that you include the current status. So if it's relatively a new ID, or if you're a new firm, you've just started up, make sure that you can be very specific in terms of where you are at now. Basically, what you're trying to do there is convince people that you're no longer just kind of fumbling around, right? You want to convince people that you have something. So just to give you a little bit more insight, before I dive into the how do you deliver a pitch, let's quickly go through each of these key components, just to highlight a couple of the key aspects. So value proposition, as I said, really what you need to focus on is what's the key pain that you're focusing on and how are you delivering a gain. So oftentimes what you see people doing is they start from the problem, what's the kind of issue that we're solving, and then they kind of add on, let's call it the secret sauce, right? The cherry on the cake. That's a gain that you're offering to your customer. So think about what would that be for your firm. So to give you an example, and obviously this isn't a law example, and I do this very intentionally because I kind of want to take you away from your comfort zone. I'm sure this is kind of the example that every single one of you knows, Air Bed and Breakfast, which is called Airbnb. And I'm sure you guys know that. So Airbnb, this is the actual slide deck that they used back in the day when they first went out to raise money. And so you can nicely follow along when you see on the right-hand top corner there the slide number. So just to show you that, this isn't something that I invented. This is their actual slide deck. So obviously welcome. And then they say, here's the problem that we're solving. Now, for those of you who don't know, Airbnb started back in 2007, 2008. So this is we need to kind of take a jump back in time. So back in that day, this was the core issue that they were facing, right? So remember, if you wanted to go online and look for hotels, what would be the kind of customer that would do that? It wasn't everybody, right? It would be the kind of person who's concerned about pricing. Typically, those were the people who Googled their way around and looked for options, right? Other traveling options. Of course, what did you find back in the day? Those were the Hiltons of this world, the Sheratons of this world. That wasn't necessarily where a price-sensitive customer wanted to go to, right? So that was an issue. So in came Airbnb to rescue those customers with their solution, being a web platform to connect travelers and hosts. I would say that's a very clear problem solution. The only thing that I would say that's missing to make this a good pitch is who their actual core customer is, right? So you want to be as specific as you can be when it comes to, sorry, I was just quickly distracted by the little heart that I saw on the chat window. But I see it's a joke, but okay, I'll continue. So who your customer is. Because basically, and I know this is tiny font, but for those of you who can't read it, the closest they get here is they say it's basically for travelers and hosts. Now, obviously, I'm sure you can imagine, think of yourself. There's huge variation in terms of profiles of who the travelers are and who the hosts are. So if this is your customer, you want to make this way more specific. Include demographics, include, if in your case, for instance, if you have a specific kind of business that you're focusing on, what kind of industry, maybe size. We just focus on companies that, for instance, have less than 50 employees or minimally 500 employees. Try and nail it as specifically as you can. That's the way to go, basically. Then you want to come in with the numbers, right? And this is why typically, obviously, in most of these cases, you see these kinds of graphs, right? Typically with a nice curve going upwards. I think I'm still to meet the first pitch where I see a line going down. This is how you try and convince outsiders that this is interesting, right? It's a big market. But there's more to it than that. You want to make sure that you also explain the mechanism behind how this is going to work. So for instance, if you want to sell something, this is about your pricing mechanism, right? If you want to make the point that you're going to save someone costs, then it's about exactly how are you going to save them costs. Let me give you an example. We're going back to Airbnb. So here's what they did. This is actually something smart to do. You'll see on the very next slide, they go into the mechanism, meaning in their case, their pricing model. But before they do that, they included something called market validation. That's a wise thing to do if you expect skepticism around your idea. So if you think that whenever you first go out, let's say, let's be honest, there's plenty of new people that kind of want to innovate the legal industry. So let's imagine that you've come up with this artificial intelligence-based idea for law, and you first go out and pitch that idea. I'm sure you're going to meet skeptics, right? People who say, never going to work. Could be, right? So then it's your job, if that's your idea, to actually preemptively take away some of that skepticism. The way to do that, because if it's very innovative, there's not going to be something out there that's exactly like what you've come up with. But there might be something that comes close enough. And that's exactly what Airbnb did. So remember, 2008, plenty of the people that they first met when they pitched this idea gave them the reaction, who on earth would want to go stay on a complete stranger's couch or house or whatever? And the other way around, who on earth would want to rent out their house to a complete stranger? I said, okay, we get that point, fair comment. So here's how they tackled this. They said, you're right, there's nothing exactly like this, but there is something that comes close. And in their case, those are the numbers that you see on the slide. There were at that point in time over 600,000 people that were registered users on couchsurfing.com. meaning people who clearly did not have a problem staying on a complete stranger's couch. And on the other side of their story, there were at that point 17,000 people who had listed their apartments, and this was just New York and San Francisco alone, on Craigslist.com. So for those of you who don't know, Craigslist is basically kind of your local ad site, if you will, right? For short-term rentals. So on both sides of their kind of value proposition of their platform, clearly there was something there that wasn't exactly what they wanted to do, but at the very least came close enough to take away a tiny bit of that criticism. That's what you want to do with a pitch. And then you go into the real numbers, right? That's when you go into, and here's how big our market is. That's what you see here, right? So what they try and cover is really, okay, so how many trips do we have worldwide? Obviously, you can't do it all, even though some of us would like to, but conquering the world tends to occur in steps. So you try and zoom it down. So they said, okay, not every single trip booked worldwide is relevant. To make it a little bit more relevant to us, we're probably initially only going to focus on those kind of customers that go for budget trips, the price-sensitive ones, right? The ones that book online. And out of that, we probably also won't be able to convince everyone. So we're going to start with this market share. That's kind of the way that you work your way down, if you will. And only then do they come to their pricing model, right? This is how do they do this. Try and keep it simple. In their case, 10% commission on each transaction. Very clear, not, this is something that's probably not going to lead to a lot of misunderstandings. That's what you want to do, especially if you have only 2 minutes, right? Just to give you an example of the other alternative, right? So imagine that some of you rather build your pitches around, we want to offer cost savings. This is an example of a company that does the same. Again, not law related, but cost savings related. It's called Yammer. So what Yammer does, it's kind of like, for those of you who don't know it, kind of like an internal Facebook, basically. So it allows employees to save time in terms of communicating. And so here's how they try to, imagine you're trying to make this pitch to CEO or CFO, right? This is how they try to sell their case. What they did was they tried to map what we as average employees spend our time on, and quite frankly, lose our time on, right? So what they gathered is if you just look at the first one, the average employee spends about 13 hours a week simply reading and answering emails. And I'm sure this has only gotten worse, right? Now, 13 hours a week still doesn't quite sound painful enough. So to really make those CEOs and CFOs feel the pain, what you then want to do is say, and so how much does that cost you, right? So 13 hours a week translates into $21,000. That's already becoming a little bit more painful. To make it even more painful, you then say, and this isn't just one employee. Imagine, for instance, that you have 1,000 employees. That comes down to nearly $10 million. That's making your customers feel the pain, right? So if your story is about cost savings, this kind of storyline helps. You want to make it tangible. Okay? So that's where the numbers come into play. That's also probably the point in time in your pitches or even presentations if you have more time and you can add more detail, where you might want to link it to some of the up and coming trends, right? There's plenty of research that you can find online that you can tie this into, but it helps to substantiate your cases, that it's not just you who think this is a good idea, but you're actually tying into something that's happening worldwide, for instance. It might also be the point in time to talk about traction, especially if you're relatively young, you don't have a lot of track record, either personally or your firm, or it's a new idea. In any of those cases, you're basically lacking track record and reputation, right? And then traction can help. Traction basically means anything that you can show that you've accomplished, that shows that whatever you're working on is increasing in popularity. Whenever people are, for instance, doing something online, that's what you see here. The way they tend to reflect that is by just simply showing page views. This is, of course, the example of Reddit, and you may say, okay, lacking track record, but this is a graph that shows 7 years, granted. But this is, for instance, an example of one of our alumni, actually, and they very proudly sent me this graph when they had launched like 2 weeks, and they said, see, our page views are increasing. Anyone can do this. Creating some sort of web page is actually quite easy. So if you want to show traction, you can do the same thing. For instance, if you track your LinkedIn views, those are all very easy things you can track just to show things are increasing. There's something going on here. And then, and this is surely relevant for every single one of you, you may also want to mention your competition. What makes you guys different? Now, there are a couple of ways in which you can talk about your competition. For instance, what you can do is you can try and map them out, every single one of them. If you have a very complex competitive landscape, I wouldn't particularly advise you to try and talk about every single one of them during your 2-minute presentation. But what you can do is, for instance, make some sort of visual where you just basically, like you see here, try and map them out on 2 dimensions. Let's say price and quality, right? And then rather than having to cover them all, imagine that you're Twitter in this slide. What you could then say is, well, I'm Twitter, and I'm positioning myself basically on the middle ground when it comes to price and quality for this and this and this reason. Then you don't have to discuss every single one of your other competitors. You can keep it more simple. The alternative approach is that you go for 2 or 3 of your key competitors and go into detail. And when I say go into detail, I mean cover both how you're similar, and let's be honest, most of the times there are things where you're similar at, but of course, ideally, there's something that you can add that shows some sort of differentiation. So some sort of, for instance, expertise that you guys have that someone else doesn't have. Profiles that you've hired that another firm does not have. Anything that helps you make the point, here's why you need to come to us rather than them. All right? That's what you're trying to do. And then, of course, tell us who you are. Now, the obvious point is the people on your team. But what I want to show you here is, think beyond that. There might be advisors, for instance, that you're working with. Could be an advisory board, but could also be simple people who, for instance, might want to recommend you, your clients, anyone that has some sort of reputation or legitimacy in your field that can help you guys boast your own legitimacy towards new outsiders that have never heard of you, right? So think of who that might be. Obviously, you first want to ask for their permission before you can do this, but it can really help, again, especially if you're kind of lacking in track record yourself. And then last but not least, you want to mention something about where you guys are at. Now, obviously, depending on your own specific cases, this can take on plenty of different forms. It could be cases that you've already tried, cases that you've won ideally, but, depending on the kind of ideas that you're working on, I don't know, maybe we have some people in here that are working on a legal startup, then you could look at things like, okay, how many people have come to a website? How many people have subscribed to emails? Do you have prototypes up and running? Those are kind of more the startup versions that you would look at, right? So it depends a bit on the exact stage where you are at, but really you want to show as much as you've accomplished as possible. And that will allow you to then end up basically by also talking about the future. What do you want to achieve moving forward? What do you say are kind of the key steps of success that you want to achieve? Let's say I want to be here 1 year from now. So what does that require for me to get to 6 months from now? And what does that require for me to get to 2 months from now? That will help kind of potential, for instance, investors, but it could also be customers, to assess the feasibility of what you're suggesting. So that's the first part. That's kind of what needs to be in a pitch. But then we get to the second equally important part, and that's how you deliver a pitch. And there is a reason I show this slide. I've used it a couple of times, and it's interesting. I can't actually see your faces, but I'm sure you guys are doing exactly what I see happening when I do this face-to-face. And this is what you get to do. I call this kind of the nightmare version of a PowerPoint. It's when people put lines of text all over their slides. And what happens every single time is people start reading what's on the slide. And they no longer listen to what you're saying. That's obviously an issue when you're trying to convince them of something, right? Because you want them to listen to you, not kind of reading whatever's on the slide, because that's just meant to be backup material. So there's clear kind of do's and don'ts when it comes to pitching. And what you'll notice is that most of the tips I'm going to give you now equally apply to giving presentations, right? So you can really very much interchange those two. So first clear tip is be quite diligent with what you put on slides. My basic tip is don't put too much on there, right? Because it's only going to distract people. Second tip I want to give you is practice. Pitching doesn't come easily. Just to give you an example, even to experts, the guy that founded PayPal is famous for saying that he didn't get his pitch right until about the 100th time that he tried it. And that's perfectly normal because it's going to require some trial and error for you to be able to assess how people react to your pitches, whether they understand it, whether they're enthusiastic, all of those different things, right? So by all means, practice. Obviously, to a certain extent that it still sounds a bit natural, right? You don't want to make this sound as though you've been rehearsing the very night before, that you kind of know it by heart. Exact wording can definitely differ, but just the core message needs to be the same. If it can only be 2 minutes, obviously it needs to be short, right? Which kind of makes sense, but because it's so short, and that's why I mentioned it, it also really needs to be easy and clear to understand. Obviously, this will depend a bit, and I'll come back to this later on. It will depend a bit on who you're pitching to. And what I mean by that is specifically their own background. So when I say, avoid geek speak, that means I'm sure you can all think immediately of a couple of, legal lingo. Terms that all of you guys understand, but none of non-legal people understand. That's okay if you're talking to another lawyer, not so okay if you're talking to a non-lawyer, right? So make sure that you know who you're talking to. JB lost video connection. Can I just check whether he's the only one or whether there's anybody else who lost video connection? Okay, so I'm assuming it's just JB. So I'll continue. Sorry, JB. So avoiding geek speak is really truly essential. So by all means, try and pay attention to this. Always try and make sure that everybody, I would say, if you're talking to a big group of people, because that's oftentimes a question that I get, what do we do if we're really talking to like 30, 50, or even more people? Then, try and make sure that you get some sense of the profiles that'll be in the room and target the average person, right? There will always be people who know less as well as people who know more. Quite frankly, the ones who know more will very easily come up to you afterwards, either during a Q&A or after that, and ask more detailed questions. But you want to make sure that you get the majority of the room with you, right? That you get them on board. So tailor yourself to the average level of knowledge or expertise in there. Now, in order to avoid being all too technical, try and see if you can use a story, or make it tangible if you can't use a story. And the way to do that is by using an example. For instance, I think most of you can probably illustrate what it is you're doing by using, and obviously I'm sure there are privacy concerns, you can anonymize it, but by using a very specific case that you've worked on. That will help to illustrate, especially to people who are not or less familiar with the field, what exactly it is that you're doing. And a story or an example just has the advantage. It's like reading a good book. It helps you take your audience with you by the hand. When people leave the room, that's what they'll remember, right? They might forget the technical lingo. They're going to remember the story. So see if you can come up with a story. To make that point even further, I'm sure some of you are wondering, what on earth are we looking at right now? But it's an important point. I want to share the story of Goldilocks. Now, I don't know if everyone knows the story of Goldilocks, so I'll just kind of give you guys the quick recap. So Goldilocks, you see in the picture, is basically running around in the wood until she comes across a little hut. And she's intrigued by the little hut, so she walks in. And when she walks in, the first thing she sees is 3 bowls of pudding. And she's a bit hungry, so she decides, okay, I'm going to have myself a bit of pudding. And so she tries the first bowl of pudding, but it's too hot, so she doesn't like that one. And so she puts it aside. She moves on to the second one, but that one's too cold. She also doesn't like that one. So then she moves on to the third one, and that one is just perfect. So she's like, okay, great, I now have my bowl of pudding, so she starts eating. Now, as we all know, eating while you're standing upright isn't that comfortable, so she decides, I'm going to sit down. The first chair she tries is really too hard, very uncomfortable. She really doesn't like that one. She tries the second chair. That one she also doesn't like. She's a bit picky. So then she moves on to the third one. That one is just perfect. So she sits down, she eats her bowl of pudding, and then she gets to the point she's done. Like most of us probably feel around noon, 2 p.m. She's obviously a bit tired. And she said, I know, taking a little nap would be a good idea right about now. So she looks around in the hut and she finds the beds of the 3 bears. She first finds the bed of Baby Bear. Now, obviously, Baby Bear is a bit tiny, so she can't really fit in that bed. So then she moves on to the bed of Papa Bear, but that one is really too big. She feels like she's floating around in the bed. So then she moves on to the third bed, which is the bed of Mama Bear, finds it, takes her little nap, all perfect. So I'll stop the story there. What's kind of the key logic? What's important for you guys to remember here? Throughout this entire story, there's always something to just right. That's the kind of logic you need to remember that also applies to the amount of detail that you put in your pitches and presentations. Put in too much detail and you're going to bore your audience to death. It does happen, right? Put in too little detail, they won't have a clue what you're talking about. So there's a right amount of detail. What that right amount is brings me back to my first point. That's practice, 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 right? That requires trial and error, figuring out, how much detail do I need to put in here so people actually understand what I'm talking about, but without boring them to death. So that's the Goldilocks story. So try to remember, practice this to see what the right amount of detail is for your cases. Related to this, you want to make sure that you make things as concrete as possible. And to illustrate this, I'm going to show you an example of a video on the guy that you see here in the picture is called Dan Heath. And Dan Heath wrote a book together with his brother called Made to Stick. If you haven't read it, it's one I can warmly recommend. And that really kind of highlights a couple of key pointers on how you can do really good presentations. One of the points he makes is to try and make it concrete. And so I'll show you the video in which he explains that point. So I'll just quickly switch the screens and share the video with you. Let me know if you can't hear it well.
Job interview situation or a graduate school essay situation or your company standing out in a competitive marketplace, you cannot stand out by being abstract. Why? Because abstraction encompasses the differences of many different people. Abstraction is zooming out. I want to show this to you. I want to prove this to you by talking about one of the most competitive idea marketplaces in the world, and that is online dating. So I think the big site here is Rendezvous. Is that right? Rendezvous.be. In the US, it's Match.com. Think about online dating as an idea marketplace for a second. You've got thousands of people, thousands of singles coming together to try to get the attention of the person who might be their soulmate. This is a pretty big deal. And what tools do you have to use in this market? Well, for those of you who have never seen an online dating site, typically you have a profile with two major elements. The first is a photo, and it's culturally considered okay to run a photo from about 10 years and 20 kilos ago. So you've got that. And then you've got a headline. And the headline is kind of a one-sentence zinger to try to lure people into your profile to find out more. And so given the stakes, you would expect these headlines to be poetry, wouldn't you? They should be witty, they should be emotional, they should be profound. Do you want to see some of the poetry that I found on the web? Here's one. Hey. Hey. Now, if there's one thing that's clear to me, it's that if hey is your headline, you better be pretty good looking, right? Friends think I am down to ETH. Do you want to date someone who can't spell earth? I don't know. Looking for love. Duh. Every person in the history of online dating could have used this one. And that's the problem with these three. They're generic, they're abstract, they could be used by anyone. How do you fix that? Well, say something concrete. How about this? Hand model turned doctor new to New York City. There aren't a lot of people on this world that could say that truthfully. I love this young woman who said, if you want to date me, must love burritos. Okay.
Okay, so let me go back to the presentation. I'll make sure I see your request, Ferdinand. I'll make sure I write it down at the end of the webinar. So what I think you guys kind of get the point, right? You know, you can't use vague language. You know, you need to be specific. If you want to claim that you're special, then tell us exactly how you're special, right? If you want to claim it's about expertise, I can pretty much guarantee you that the vast majority amongst you is going to claim that, right? So tell us exactly which kind of expertise. Use examples to back that statement up. Be specific and be concrete. To continue the point of making sure that you're kind of clear and easy to understand, the last thing I kind of want to show you is the aspect of what I call, it's the story of the magical grain truck. I'm sure, yes, indeed. I see Floor has already done it for me. Thank you, Floor. So what's the story of magical grain truck? Well, maybe some of you, it's kind of the same logic, are more familiar with Mary Poppins in her bag, or, you know, a little bit more recent in the Harry Potter movie Hermione, kind of the same idea. You know, you have this big bag and things keep popping out of it where you're like, where on earth did this come from? It's kind of the same idea with our magical truck. So imagine that you're the driver of this truck, right? Which basically means that your job, day in, day out, is you pick up grain in one location, you drive to the next location, you drop it off, get paid, and you drive back to the first location and do the whole thing all over again. That's what you do, day in, day out. Yeah? Now imagine that you're that driver, and suddenly, one day, you wake up and your truck can magically hold 12 times as much grain. If you're the driver of that truck, you're going to love that situation, right? Because it means you now only need to drive once, whereas before you needed to drive 12 times back and forth, right? That's the kind of idea that you want to apply to the words that you use in a pitch, even in a presentation. Because if you don't have a lot of time, you basically want to kind of magically inflate the words that you use. So that means putting as much weight as you possibly can on as few words as you possibly can. The way to do that is by basically using analogies. You can do that visually, right? So this is, if we go back to our competition example, why you occasionally, if you have something very complex to explain, having a visual can really help, right? It can really, we often say a picture says more than 1,000 words. Well, okay, it's a bit of a cliche. It really is a bit true as well. So complex, think visual. Another thing what you can do is rely on verbal analogies. This is why you oftentimes hear people referring to famous examples. For instance, saying, we're the Uber for, right? And then they insert whatever industry they're working in. We all know what Uber does. We can also have, you know, some sort of an ID, and that will make it clearer for us to immediately make the link, that's what these guys are doing. So that's using analogies. Again, if you only have 2 minutes, and this might be the point in time where I may want to point out, I'm not saying that you should do all of these tips, right? Pick and choose what works for you guys. You don't want to turn this into a show. So make sure that it's kind of relevant for your specific cases, but I'm just basically giving you the menu of all the different things that you could do. And so this is one. Think of some analogies that you could potentially use. Moving on, like I said before, make sure you target your audience. That not only applies to their level of expertise, it also applies to what they're looking for. If you're going to be pitching to a customer, they'll want to hear different things than versus if you're pitching to an employee, right? A customer is not really going to particularly be interested in how you guys are making money. What they will be interested in is what kind of value can you create for them. And that value is going to be different for a potential customer than for a potential employee. So know who you're talking to and adapt your pitch according to the audience. Next to that, I already said use numbers, but most people kind of tend to stop at this is how big of a market we're going for, or this is how many costs that we're saving you. Really, I would advise every single one of you to use numbers wherever possible, right? Because it really does help to justify your value proposition. So because if you're going to use, and that's why I use this slide, if you're going to use words like massive, big, fast, those are, again, quite vague words. And more importantly, they mean something different, potentially at least, to you than to me, right? Whatever a big market is to you may not be a big market to me. And that's something that you need to avoid in a pitch setting. So rather than saying this is a big market, it's better to say this is a market of 2.4 billion. You can have a discussion about whether or not that number is correct, but you're not going to have a discussion about what it means. So that's why it tends to be better. It's a more objective basis to justify your ideas. And to illustrate that a little bit more, I'm going to show you a second video of a guy that really uses numbers very well. Just to warn you a little bit, what I definitely would not repeat is the pace at which he speaks. Because if you think I speak fast, you haven't met this guy, right? So this is one that I wouldn't repeat, but the way he does it is really, really good and very much illustrates the value of using numbers. So let me introduce you to Josh Light.
My name is Josh Light, and I'm the CEO of CupAd, and we believe that we have the most effective form of advertising available in the market today. Our advertisements are exposed to customers for 2,220 seconds on average. Now, what kind of advertising has that kind of exposure time? Ladies and gentlemen, we advertise on coffee cups. That's right, we put your brand in their hand. So how does coffee cup advertising work? Well, we got an advertiser. They pay us money. We produce paper coffee cups with their advertisement or brand on it. Then we give these coffee cups to coffee stands for free. Now, why does someone want to advertise on a coffee cup? Because it takes an individual 37 minutes to drink a cup of coffee on average. That person's going to have to look at the cup, drink, look at the cup, drink 20 times before it's fully consumed. And that person's going to move around like a mobile billboard, exposing that brand to at least 6 different individuals before that cup is drank. What's in it for CupAd? We make 13 cents of profit on every single cup that we distribute. And what's in it for the coffee stands? Well, when most people think about coffee stands, they think about Starbucks. But what about the 25,000 coffee stands in this nation that have plain white cups like this? They don't have the economies to scale to put their own brand on the cup. So we give them free cups. They save $15,000 a year by not buying cups. They like these savings so much, ladies and gentlemen, that approximately 80% of the stands that we've contacted have signed exclusivity agreements to distribute our cups. And what kind of momentum have we started for this company? The last month alone, we got 58 coffee stands in California to sign exclusivity agreements with us to distribute our cups. If we continue to get 58 coffee stands every single month, for the next 12 months, we will have 700 coffee stands at the end of the year. With 700 coffee stands, we can move 8 million cups a month. And at 13-cent profit, 8 million cups a month, we're making over $1 million of profit every single month. And we've already started this, ladies and gentlemen. In fact, our first customer, Overstock.com, will see their cups hit the California market in 21 days. Thank you very much.
So I think you now see what I mean by talking fast, right? So definitely will repeat that, but some of you may wonder, isn't this guy using too many numbers, right? It's a bit overwhelming. Very much agree with that point. But what he has accomplished is that at the very least, once you've listened to this, you're intrigued by this idea. And remember what I said in the very beginning. That's really what you want to do with a pitch. You just want to make sure that people are slightly intrigued by what it is that you're trying to say, to make them a little bit more enthusiastic to say, you know what, I'm going to look into this a little bit further. And that's what you're trying to do. So you could probably do with a little bit, less numbers, but still, it shows the power of numbers. It really, at the very least, tells you this guy knows what he's talking about. And that's what you're going for. And yes, Sergio, I very much agree. He oftentimes repeats, ladies and gentlemen. I actually oftentimes also get the question, like, isn't he a bit, much? And that, I think, also depends a bit on culture, audience, know who you're talking to, right? So that also requires knowing a little bit kind of where you are and what's kind of accepted practice, because definitely that will also depend a bit. But in general, I think he gets away with it. Okay, so I think that shows the importance of quantifying. Then also definitely make sure, when you're pitching, you're trying to sell an idea. You're not trying to educate your audience. So what you're not trying to do is show off what a genius you are, basically. What you're trying to do is you're trying to convince people of how you're creating value for them. And that's kind of important to remember in the sense of, if we kind of take the balance between concrete versus value, if you look at the quote that I put on the slide, you want to make sure that you don't stay as vague than just to kind of say, well, we're better or faster. That's too vague. But you also don't want to go the other way around and try and basically tell people, and this is especially a trap for typically more technical people, but still, by going to the other extreme, then kind of summarizing all the different technical features that you guys work on. That's also not the best idea. Make sure that you translate those features into, so how does this help my customer? If you have expertise in law XYZ, I'm sure most of your customers won't know those laws. So make sure that you can apply it to their cases, their stories. How is this going to help me? Great that you know all those laws, but how is it going to help my case? That's what you kind of basically need to say. And by all means, go broadly. So think beyond, every single person that you might be possibly creating value for. It could be, stakeholders. It could be fellow colleagues, maybe even. The broader you can go, the better. Last but not least, definitely also important to be a bit passionate. Now, an important side remark I want to make here, also kind of tying it back to our Josh video, is obviously stay true to your own natural style of speaking. If you're not a person who's kind of, hopping around on a stage, then by all means don't try and do that now. However, it is important that you come across as though you're convinced about what it is you're selling. Because if you're not convinced, I can assure you that your audience isn't going to become convinced, right? If you're kind of saying, nah, I'm not entirely sure, I don't think that's the best way to convince a customer. Another thing that you can do to really try and make sure, especially if you have a little bit more time, occasionally what can happen is attention might die away, right? And there are a couple of tricks that you can use. Actually, there's 3 tricks. To make sure that you kind of grab attention or re-grab attention. First one is think of a kind of very catchy first and last sentence, kind of a punchline. Whatever that might mean for your cases. There's an example, I'm sure I can send you the link afterwards, of a video I occasionally use of a company called Sanergy that focus on sanitation. And they, for instance, start their pitch by saying, holy crap. Kind of fitting if you see what they're working on. That's something that you're going to remember tomorrow. So think of what that could be for you guys. Another thing that you can use is questions. Oftentimes you'll see people kind of opening up their presentations by asking the audience a question, but it's also something you can do in the middle of your presentation, for instance, if you fear that attention might be dying away. Obviously, again here, trial and error is quite important. Make sure that you know what the answer is going to be, right? Because otherwise, you're kind of completely shooting in your own foot if you don't. Using silence can be another trick. It's actually something that we've learned from musicians. And I don't know if any of you are musicians by any chance, but they very deliberately include pauses in music sheets. Well, it's something, why do we do that? And that's something that also holds for presentations, is when we shut up, people are like, oh, what's happening, right? And you recapture that attention. Obviously, not for 30 seconds, right? But just a tiny pause can help to recapture that attention. This is the book that we were referring to. So for those who wanted to write it down, so this is the Made to Stick book. And for those of you who say, I don't have enough time to read it, I'll just give you the quick summary. Basically, what he says in that book is any good presentation should follow the SUCCESS acronym. And what you will see is that we've actually covered the vast majority of this, right? It needs to be simple, easy and clear to understand. You see the concrete aspect there, that was the video. The one in the middle, we haven't yet covered. So what that means is including something unexpected. That can be, for instance, including a joke, right? Something that people don't expect and that will have the effect of, again, kind of capturing that attention. Very important if you want to include a joke, again, trial and error, right? Because what you find funny might not necessarily be what someone else finds funny. So be a bit careful there. Trial and error is kind of important in this context. What else do you see on there? It needs to be credible. That's why you include the numbers, trends to back your story up to make sure that it's not just your beliefs. The story element we've also covered. So the only one that remains is the emotional aspect. What does that mean? By all means, does not mean to making kind of your audience cry, but it means more establishing some sort of personal relationship. For instance, you can do this by two ways. Now, if I start sharing a story about, let's say, my grandmother, it tends to have the effect that most of you will also think of your grandmothers, because we all, either have or have had a grandmother at some point. So it's something that people can very easily relate to. And that kind of buy-in helps them to, again, remember your story. Another thing that you can do is, for instance, address people in the audience. Again, maybe trial and error. Not everybody likes this. Not everybody likes being picked out. What you can always do if it's a really important presentation is have some sort of ally in the audience, meaning people that you've simply told up front, I'm going to pick you out. Are you okay with this? That can help as well. So establishing some sort of personal relationship. Last but not least, what I want to share with you is another book. The lady that you see in this picture is called Nancy Duarte. And what she did was she basically studied some of what we call the great speeches of this day and age, right? Ranging from Martin Luther King to Steve Jobs when he used to do his product introductions. And what she was looking for is, do some of these great speeches have something in common? And given that I'm showing it to you, I'm sure you can guess the answer to that question. So she wrote a book about it called Resonate. And basically, the key message of that book is, here's the structure that you tend to find in those great speeches. So what they start off with is describing what she calls the what is situation. So that is the world today, basically. The situation as we're facing it now, or as your customer is facing it now. And then what you want to do is you want to compare that to the what could be. What could our world look like if we resolve, for instance, problem X and Y, if they team up with you guys? And obviously, what you want to do is you want to make the gap between those two as big as you possibly can, right? Because you want to make the current world, the current situation, as undesirable as you can possibly make it. Now, the trick, though, is typically when you tend to do this, when you tend to give people, imagine saying this to a CEO, right? Your current situation really isn't what you should be doing. This is bad for all sorts of reasons. The average person doesn't tend to like that kind of message. So, and that's why you see the pattern that you see on the picture. What you need to do is you need to ease them into that message. And that's why you move back and forth between the current situation, the what is, and the what could be. It's a bit like sailing. Whenever you feel resistance, you can never go straight to your goal. You need to zigzag your way into it. It's the same idea, basically. If you think there might be resistance, go back and forth between the current situation and what it is that you're trying to get to. So, wrapping this all up, that brings me to the end of my story. I hope that this has showed you that basically what you can do with a pitch. I always kind of say, really try and approach it as kind of a learning opportunity. It can really give you tremendous feedback on how people perceive you, how they look at you, what they think, even if you disagree with it, what they think points of improvement or weaknesses are. So really approach it as moment for feedback. And I think if there's, kind of key pointers that you need to remember, they're on the bottom of the slide, right? So make sure that you think of what is your value proposition? Who are you guys? Try and include as many numbers. Do a little Josh in there. And what's your current status? And make sure that you think about, the storytelling, avoiding the geek speak, and use visuals or analogies wherever you can. So I hope this was useful. By all means, if you were to have some additional questions, feel free to reach out. I'm more than happy to try and address them. We still have 5 more minutes, so in any case, if any of you would have questions right now, more than happy to take them. But maybe in the meantime, I will already give the floor back to Agnieszka.
Oh, thank you very much, Veronique. It was a pleasure to be here with you. And to all of you as well, thank you very much for engaging. And I'm looking forward to another opportunity to meet, perhaps during the next webinar that we will be having. Again, as Veronique said, we will remain open for a few more minutes if you have any questions. As Giuseppe mentioned, the recording of the webinar will be sent to all of you. Thank you very much. Have a nice evening, morning, in whatever time zone you are currently. Bye.
Bye.